At 9:17 on the morning of January 22, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George crouched inside the ruins of a captured Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz, watching a banyan tree 240 yards away through a rifle scope his fellow officers had mocked for 6 weeks. He was 27 years old, an Illinois state shooting champion, and had 0 confirmed kills. 11 Japanese snipers were operating in the Point Cruz groves. In 72 hours, they had killed 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. George's commanding officer had called his rifle a toy. Other platoon leaders called it his mail-order sweetheart when he unpacked a Winchester Model 70 with a Lyman Alaskan scope and Griffin and Howe mount back at Camp Forest, Tennessee. The armorer asked if it was meant for deer or Germans. George answered calmly that it was for the Japanese. The rifle hadn't arrived with him. He spent the voyage to Guadalcanal watching other men clean their Garands while his own rifle sat in a warehouse in Illinois. He requested it be forwarded through military mail. 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked "Fragile." Inside was the rifle George had bought with 2 years of National Guard pay. The Winchester weighed 9 pounds. The scope added 12 ounces. The standard issue M1 Garand weighed slightly more, carried 8 rounds, and fired semi-automatically. George's rifle was bolt action, 5 rounds. Captain Morris ordered him to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and carry a real weapon. George carried it anyway. The 132nd Infantry relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal in late December. The Marines had taken and held Henderson Field but never cleared Mount Austin or the coastal groves west of the Matanikau. Mount Austin, 1,514 feet tall, known to the Japanese as the Gifu, was defended by 500 men in 47 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17th. They fought for 16 days, losing 34 killed and 279 wounded before taking the western slope on January 2nd. By then, George had fired his Winchester exactly 0 times in combat. Point Cruz was different. No bunkers, no fixed lines, just Japanese soldiers who had retreated into massive trees and learned to wait. Some were snipers. They knew the jungle. They knew how to disappear. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he filled canteens at a creek. On January 20th, 2 more men died on patrol. On January 21st, 3 more were killed. 1 shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had passed twice. That night, the battalion commander summoned George. The snipers were killing men faster than malaria. He needed someone who could shoot. He wanted to know if that mail-order rifle could actually do anything. George listed his credentials: Illinois state champion at 1,000 yards in 1939, the youngest ever, 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights, 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards with the Lyman Alaskan. The commander gave him until morning to prove it. If this story matters to you, liking the video helps more people find it. Back to George. He spent the night cleaning Cosmoline from the rifle, checking mounts, and loading 5 rounds of .30-06 hunting ammunition he had packed in Tennessee. Same cartridge as the Garand. At dawn on January 22nd, he moved into a Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. It overlooked the coconut groves west of Point Cruz, where intelligence said the snipers operated from banyan trees, some 90 feet tall with 8-foot trunks. George brought no spotter, no radio, just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds on stripper clips. The Lyman Alaskan offered only 2.5 times magnification, but it was enough to catch movement the naked eye missed. The jungle was never silent. George filtered the noise and watched for motion, scanning slowly. At 9:17, he saw it. A branch moved. No wind. 87 feet up. Then the shape. Dark clothing, wedged where 3 branches met, facing east toward the supply trail. George adjusted 2 clicks for wind, controlled his breathing, and pressed the trigger. The Winchester kicked into his shoulder. The crack echoed through the jungle. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked and fell. His body dropped through the branches and hit the ground 90 feet below the banyan tree. George worked the bolt, the empty casing flipped clear, and he chambered another round. He kept the scope on the tree and waited. Nothing. The sniper's partner would be nearby. Japanese snipers worked in pairs, shooter and spotter. If George had killed the shooter, the spotter was either in that tree or one close by. With only 2.5 times magnification, he searched slowly, banyan by banyan. The canopy threw deep shadows. Careless scanning missed men entirely. At 9:43, George found the second sniper in a different tree 60 yards north, lower, about 50 feet up, moving down the trunk. He had heard the shot and knew the position was compromised. George led the movement and fired. The man fell backward. His rifle clattered through branches. Both struck the jungle floor seconds apart. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded from a stripper clip, hands steady, breathing controlled. This was Camp Perry, except the targets shot back. At 11:21, a Japanese round slammed into the sandbags 6 inches from George's head, spraying dirt into his face. He rolled left and pressed against the bunker wall. The shot came from the southwest, another angle. George waited 3 minutes, then edged back to position and glassed the trees. The shooter would relocate after firing, but in jungle this dense options were limited. At 11:38, George spotted him, third tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up. The sniper had shifted branches but stayed in the same tree. A mistake. George centered the crosshairs and fired. The third sniper fell without a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread through the battalion. Men who had mocked his mail-order rifle now asked if they could watch him work. George refused. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. After the 5th kill, the Japanese adapted. They stopped moving during daylight. George spent the afternoon glassing trees and finding nothing. At 1600, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The mockery was gone. He wanted George back in position at dawn. January 23rd began with heavy tropical rain. Visibility dropped below 100 yards. George waited it out in the bunker. The rain eased at 8:15. By 8:45, the jungle opened enough to work. At 9:12, George spotted the first sniper of the day. The Japanese soldier had climbed during the rain, smart. The noise masked movement. This one chose a tree 290 yards out, longer than yesterday, also smart. They were learning. George adjusted for distance and fired. The sniper fell. The 6th kill triggered a response George hadn't expected. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began walking rounds toward his bunker. The first salvo landed 40 yards short. The second landed 20 yards short. The third would hit. George grabbed his rifle and sprinted north along the tree line, diving into a shell crater as the bunker vanished in explosions behind him. He relocated to a fallen tree 120 yards north, cover and a clear view. From there, the hunt resumed. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon. They were hunting him now. This was no longer target shooting, it was a duel. At 14:23, George killed his 7th. At 15:41, his 8th. This one, 94 feet up a banyan. Good concealment, but the height silhouetted him against the sky. When the sun angle shifted at 1700, Captain Morris recalled George. He had been in position 9 hours. George reported 8 confirmed kills over 2 days. 12 rounds fired, 8 kills, 4 misses. Morris ordered him to continue at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and did the math. 11 snipers had operated in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were dead. 3 remained, the best. And now they knew what George looked like and what rifle he carried. He tried to sleep at 3 o'clock, failed, and sat with the rifle across his lap. Rain returned at 4:15, heavy enough to delay dawn operations. George used the cover to move again, not the bunker, not the fallen tree. He chose a cluster of large rocks 70 yards south, once used as a Marine machine gun nest. The position offered solid cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. The rain slowed to a drizzle at 7:43. Visibility improved. At 8:17 on January 24th, George found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier had chosen a palm tree 190 yards out, only 40 feet up, concealment over elevation. From ground level, he was invisible. From George's elevated rocks, he wasn't. Through the fronds, George could see the dark outline of shoulders and head. George aimed, controlled his breathing, and began to squeeze the trigger, then stopped. Something was wrong. The position was too obvious, too easy. He had been hunting snipers for 3 days and killed 8 men. The remaining 3 would not make elementary mistakes. not unless it was bait. He lowered the rifle and scanned the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for muzzle flash, ready to return fire. George glassed the jungle methodically, left to right, top to bottom, checking every tree within 300 yards. 11 minutes later, at 8:28, he found the real threat. A banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. The sniper sat in a perfect hide, concealed by branches and vines on 3 sides. He had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to appear there, or to shoot the bait. George had 2 problems. If he fired at the real sniper, the shot would reveal his position and give the enemy time to relocate. If he did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George was no longer at the fallen tree and begin searching. George decided to use the bait against them. He aimed at the decoy in the palm tree, adjusted for wind, and fired. The decoy jerked and fell. George immediately swung the rifle to the banyan. The real sniper reacted to the sound, turned. That movement was enough. George caught the shift, placed the crosshairs, and fired before the man could complete the turn. The real sniper fell. His rifle followed. 2 shots, 2 kills. But George's position was now exposed. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition and moved fast, east along the rocks, dropping into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. At 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire tore into the rocks he had occupied seconds earlier. Dust and stone exploded where he had been. The fire lasted 17 seconds. George counted to 60, then relocated again. 100 yards east into a shell crater half filled with rainwater. He settled in with water up to his chest, rested the Winchester on the rim, and resumed glassing. 10 confirmed kills. 1 remained. The last sniper would be the best. He had watched 10 men die over 3 days. He knew George's tactics, his rifle, and his approximate position. Somewhere in the jungle, he was waiting. George scanned carefully. The Lyman Alaskan made distant shapes visible but indistinct. Every shadow could be a branch or a man. At 9:47, George realized his mistake. The 11th sniper wasn't in the trees, he was on the ground. George caught movement in his peripheral vision. 60 yards south, low, sliding through undergrowth parallel to the tree line. The Japanese sniper was crawling, using ferns, vines, and fallen branches for cover, moving toward George's last known position. George remained motionless in the water-filled crater. The rifle was already shouldered. His breathing stayed controlled, but the angle was wrong. The crater rim blocked his shot. To fire, he would have to rise and expose himself. At 9:52, the Japanese sniper stopped moving. The Japanese sniper had reached a position 40 yards from the rocks. George watched through the scope as the man studied the position, searching for movement. George waited. Patience was the core skill of sniper work, the discipline to let time pass and refuse a bad shot. At 9:58, the sniper began moving again, 35 yards, 30, 25. He approached from the south, the same route George had used when he evacuated under machine gun fire. George understood immediately. The sniper had observed the earlier attack. He knew George had moved east. Now he was hunting along the most likely escape route. At 10:03, the sniper reached the rocks and slipped into the machine gun nest, facing east toward the drainage ditch, where George should have been. The man was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater, back fully exposed. An easy center-mass shot. George did not fire. This sniper had survived 10 days in the Point Cruz groves. He had outlived 10 others. He would not linger in an exposed position. This felt wrong. Too open, too obvious. George widened his scan. At 10:06, he found the real problem. A second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest of the rocks, concealed behind a fallen tree. He wasn't moving. He was watching. His rifle was aimed toward the drainage ditch. 2 men, not 1. They were working together. George couldn't take both. The bolt-action Winchester meant a pause between shots, enough time for the survivor to locate him and return fire. He needed a different solution. George sank deeper into the crater, submerging, until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the water. He kept the Winchester angled upward to protect the barrel and waited. At 10:13, the sniper in the rocks stood. He had watched the ditch for 10 minutes and seen nothing. He assumed George had moved farther east. He signaled to his partner. Both men began moving east in parallel, 70 yards apart, a coordinated sweep. George stayed motionless as they passed his position. When they were fully between him and the tree line, their backs exposed, George rose slowly from the water. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder, water dripping from the barrel, his sleeves, his face. He did not rush. He had waited for this moment. George aimed at the closer soldier, the one who had used the rocks for cover, now 42 yards away. He fired. The soldier dropped instantly. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, and swung the rifle toward the second man behind the fallen tree. The Japanese soldier was already turning, raising his rifle. George fired first. The second man collapsed beside the log. 11 shots fired over 3 days, 11 Japanese snipers dead. The Point Cruz groves were cleared of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. George climbed out of the crater to retrieve his spent cartridges. That was when he heard it. Voices, Japanese voices. Multiple men moving through the trees toward the fallen snipers. The snipers had not been alone. George dropped back into the crater. The water was cold and muddy. He submerged until only his eyes were above the surface, holding the Winchester vertically to keep the barrel clear. The voices grew louder. At least 6 men, possibly more. These were infantry, not snipers. A patrol sent to investigate or recover bodies. Branches snapped, equipment rattled. The voices stopped at the first body, 40 yards from George's position. He could hear them clearly now. Then they moved to the second body. The tone shifted, urgent, sharp. At 10:28, the voices began moving again, not back toward the tree line, but toward the crater. They had found his tracks. George had controlled noise and movement, but not the mud. Boot prints led directly to him. He checked his ammunition. 5 rounds in the rifle. At least 6 Japanese soldiers closing in. Bad odds for a bolt-action rifle. He waited. 30 yards, 25, 20. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the rim of the crater, looking straight down. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still submerged and fired again. 2 more soldiers were at the rim. Both dropped. 3 rounds left. Shouting erupted. More soldiers were moving in. George climbed out of the crater on the north side and sprinted 20 yards to a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle. Bullets struck the ground around the crater and the log. They were firing at sound and movement, not confirmed targets. George stayed low and glassed the area. 2 soldiers were advancing toward the crater, 50 yards out. He fired. 1 dropped. The second dove for cover. 2 rounds left. More voices came from behind him. The Japanese were flanking, 1 group from the south, another from the east. George was about to be surrounded. He made the decision instantly. He could not win a sustained firefight with a bolt-action rifle against multiple soldiers. He broke contact. George ran north, crashing through vines and undergrowth, branches cutting his face. Rifle fire followed him. Bullets snapped past and struck trees. He ran for 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed himself into the dirt and listened. The voices were distant now. They had stopped pursuing. George checked his rifle. Mud coated the stock. Water still dripped from the barrel. He had 2 rounds left and no stripper clips. The clips were in his pack, left behind near the water-filled crater. At 10:47, George began moving again, not running, walking, staying low, using terrain for cover. He moved northeast toward American lines. The jungle was quiet. No voices, no movement, only his breathing and distant artillery. At 11:13, George reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself and was escorted through. He walked straight to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. Morris ordered a full debrief. George gave it. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired against snipers. 11 hits. Then contact with infantry. 3 additional kills during the firefight. 5 rounds expended in that engagement. Morris asked about ammunition. George had 2 rounds left. He asked about the rifle. George said it was functional but needed cleaning. Mud in the action, water in the barrel. Morris told him to clean the rifle and stand down. The battalion would move east the next day. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. Intelligence indicated the Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal and would complete withdrawal within 2 weeks. George returned to his tent. He field-stripped the Winchester and spent 2 hours cleaning every component. Patches soaked in oil ran through the barrel until they came out clean. He checked the scope mounts, adjusted eye relief, and loaded 5 fresh rounds by 1400. Then word came down from division headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see him. George walked to headquarters expecting discipline, unauthorized solo action, operating alone, ammunition expenditure. Instead, he found Morris and 2 other officers waiting. One was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had one question: could George train other men to do what he had done? George said he could try, but it would require time, rifles with optics, and men who could already shoot. Ferry told him the division had 14 Springfield rifles with scopes left behind by the Marines and 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry wanted George to form and train a sniper section to eliminate remaining Japanese threats in American operational areas. George agreed on one condition: he would keep his Winchester. Ferry approved. George kept his Winchester Model 70. The Springfield rifles went to the men. Training began on January 27th. George assembled 40 soldiers at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. On paper, they were expert marksmen, qualified with iron sights out to 500 yards. None had combat sniper experience. None had killed from concealment. George would change that. George began with fundamentals: breath control, trigger squeeze, reading wind. The Springfield rifles weighed 11 pounds with scopes, heavier than the Garand and heavier than George's Winchester. The weight added stability but caused fatigue. George taught the men to use any support available: rocks, logs, sandbags. The jungle rarely offered perfect firing positions. Snipers had to adapt and build stability from whatever the terrain allowed. Range training lasted 3 days. The men fired at stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards, then moving targets, then targets partially concealed by vegetation. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George organized them into 16 two-man teams: shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand, responsible for target detection and security. After each engagement, roles could switch, keeping both men proficient and reducing dependence on a single shooter. On February 1st, George led 4 teams into the field to clear Japanese positions west of the Botanical River. Intelligence indicated small groups of Japanese infantry stragglers remained in the area. At dawn, the teams moved into position. George paired with Corporal Hayes and set up on high ground overlooking a resupply trail. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier appeared. Hayes confirmed. George fired. The soldier dropped. Over the next 6 hours, their team engaged 7 more, 6 kills, 1 miss due to wind. The other teams reported similar results. 23 Japanese soldiers were killed that day. No American casualties. Operations continued into early February. By February 9th, the sniper section recorded 74 confirmed kills, only counted when bodies were observed. Japanese evacuation accelerated, with destroyers extracting troops at night from Cape Esperance. American forces pushed west to disrupt the withdrawal. George's teams eliminated Japanese soldiers covering retreat routes. On February 7th, near the Tandem Bogar River, a Japanese rifleman shot George. The bullet struck his left shoulder, spinning him down. Hayes pulled him to cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious but survivable. Through muscle, no bone or major vessels hit. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors treated and sutured the wound. He would recover, but no combat operations for several weeks. George spent 2 weeks in the field hospital. During that time, the Japanese completed their evacuation. On February 9th, American troops reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The Guadalcanal campaign was over. George's sniper section had operated for 12 days, 74 confirmed kills, 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. Division headquarters formally recognized the unit. Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star. But George's war was not finished. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a new mission, classified overseas somewhere in Burma. By March, George volunteered. He boarded a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 was sealed in a waterproof case in the cargo hold. The Lyman Alaskan scope was wrapped in oilcloth. George wasn't told details, only that the mission involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, and operations behind Japanese lines, the kind of fighting where a man who could hit targets at 600 yards might matter. The transport reached India on April 3rd. George and 200 other officers were briefed. They were joining a new unit, roughly 3,000 men. It had no official name yet. The men called themselves Merrill's Marauders. The unit would later be designated the 5,307th Composite Unit on May 28, 1943, but training had already begun. The concept was simple and brutal: long-range penetration, jungle survival, no supply lines. The unit was modeled after British Brigadier Ord Wingate's Chindits, small mobile forces operating deep behind enemy lines for extended periods. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. Officially, he was a rifle platoon leader. The Army still had no sniper designation, but Colonel Ferry's recommendation followed him. Battalion commanders knew what George could do with a rifle. Training took place in central India. The terrain differed from Guadalcanal, but the fundamentals remained: heat, humidity, dense vegetation, limited visibility. Burma would be worse: steeper ground, heavier rain, an enemy who knew the jungle better than any American force. George modified his equipment. Guadalcanal had allowed short operations and resupply. Burma would mean patrols lasting weeks, hundreds of miles on foot. Weight mattered. He replaced the Lyman Alaskan with a lighter Weaver 330 scope, same magnification, 8 ounces less. He swapped the wooden stock for a lighter version. The rifle dropped from 9 pounds, 12 ounces to 8 pounds, 14 ounces. It wasn't much. Over a 2-week patrol carrying 60 pounds of gear, it mattered. The Marauders entered Burma in February 1944. Their objective was Myitkyina Airfield, critical for Allied supply routes into China. Japanese forces held the area with roughly 4,000 troops. The Marauders would approach overland through terrain the Japanese considered impassable: mountains, rivers, dense jungle, no roads, limited trails. Everything they needed, they carried. No artillery support, only rifles, mortars, and the ability to move fast through impossible terrain. George's battalion began the march on February 24th. In the first week, they covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases rose daily. Pack mules struggled on steep descents. Several had to be shot after breaking legs. By March, the battalion had covered 217 miles. They engaged Japanese forces 12 times. Short skirmishes, ambushes, quick firefights followed by immediate withdrawal. The Marauders were not meant to hold ground. Their purpose was disruption: cut supply lines, harass rear areas, create chaos behind Japanese positions. George used his Winchester 3 times during the march, once at 412 yards against a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing, once at 380 yards against a machine gun position, once at 290 yards against a sniper pinning down a patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. He never fired twice in the same engagement. The Winchester's report was distinctive, sharper than the Garand. 1 shot announced his presence. A second would give the enemy time to locate him. George learned to shoot and move immediately. The march to Myitkyina took 3 months. By late May, the Marauders had covered more than 700 miles. Disease took a heavier toll than combat: malaria, dysentery, typhus. Of the 5,300 men who entered Burma, fewer than 3,000 remained effective. On May 17th, the Marauders captured Myitkyina Airfield. The objective was achieved, but the unit was spent. Too many casualties, too much time in the jungle without rest or proper medical care. The formation was combat ineffective. George survived the Burma campaign. His Winchester survived too, but the rifle that had proven so decisive on Guadalcanal saw limited use. Only 7 shots fired during months of operations. Most fighting in Burma happened at close range, ambushes inside dense vegetation where visibility was measured in feet, not yards. George drew a hard conclusion. The Winchester Model 70 was an exceptional rifle, perhaps the finest bolt-action sporting rifle ever made, but warfare was changing. Semi-automatic rifles like the Garand were becoming standard. The future favored volume of fire over precision at distance. There would be no next war for George, at least not immediately. In June 1944, he was evacuated from Burma with the rest of the marauders. The unit was disbanded. George was reassigned to training duties in the United States. He returned home in July 1944, promoted to captain and posted to Fort Benning, Georgia. His job was training infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics, how to move through jungle terrain, identify targets, operate independently without supply lines. He kept his Winchester Model 70. It had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee, to Guadalcanal, to India, to Burma, and back to Georgia. It had accounted for at least 14 confirmed enemy kills, likely more. George stopped counting after Burma. The rifle rested in a footlocker at Fort Benning. George rarely looked at the rifle. The war had changed. The Pacific Islands were being retaken one by one. American forces were pushing through France and into Germany. The era of individual marksmen carrying privately owned rifles was fading. The military was standardizing. Mass production, interchangeable parts, identical weapons, identical training. George understood why. Modern warfare required scale. But something was being lost: individual skill, craftsmanship. The idea that one man, properly trained with the right rifle, could alter the outcome of a fight. George was discharged from the Army in January 1947 as a lieutenant colonel. 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, Combat Infantryman Badge. He returned to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton University under the GI Bill. He studied politics and graduated with highest honors in 1950. After Princeton, he spent 4 years at Oxford, then 4 years in British East Africa studying regional politics and institutions. He eventually settled in Washington, D.C., serving as executive director of the Institute of African Affairs and later as a consultant and lecturer at the State Department's Foreign Service Institute. During those years, George never spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma. Colleagues knew he had served in the Pacific. They did not know about Point Cruz. They did not know about the snipers. They did not know about the Winchester Model 70 stored quietly in his home. In 1947, George began writing, not for publication, but for record. He wanted to document jungle warfare while the details were still precise. Weapons, ballistics, tactics. 6 months later, the manuscript exceeded 400 pages. A friend at the National Rifle Association read it and urged publication. George resisted. The work was technical, clinical, unemotional. But the NRA persisted. The book was published as Shots Fired in Anger. It became a classic, not because it glorified combat, but because it didn't. It recorded what worked and what failed, without embellishment or myth. It remains in print today and is still cited by historians and firearms experts studying World War II small arms. George lived long enough to see Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. He watched rifles evolve from the Garand to the M14 to the M16. He watched sniping become a formal military specialty with doctrine, training, and equipment, lessons learned decades earlier, refined by new generations. John George died on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 that cleared the Point Cruz groves was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It rests in a display case with a simple placard. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. It looks like an ordinary hunting rifle. It isn't. It is the rifle that proved a civilian marksman with a mail-order scope could outshoot professionally trained military snipers. The rifle that ended a lethal threat in 4 days when an entire battalion could not stop it in 2 weeks. The rifle that quietly reshaped how the U.S. military thought about individual marksmanship. And now you know its story. If this story mattered to you, hit the like button. It tells YouTube to share it with more people. Subscribe for more archive-based World War II history, and leave a comment below. Where are you watching from, and had you ever heard this story before? Every interaction helps keep these forgotten stories alive.